It's ask me to make sure my mic's on. It's on. I don't know if you can tell.
Yeah, I can tell actually.
Can you? Okay.
Well,
Yeah. All right, let's pull together. We got a little work to do here before 5:45. That's when the class ends. 5:45. Okay. So now we get into our first book. We're going to look at 1 Samuel, and it's a little comical discussion of why we have 1 and 2 Samuel. Probably due to scroll length. Really, we're talking about one continuous work, the book of Samuel. So you probably hear me talk about Samuel. I might have to break them out if we're talking about 1 and 2 Samuel. So really, we're talking about one continuous history there with regards to finding and getting us to Israel's first true king, King David. Eventually, we'll get there. Samuel is going to be the precursor to getting us to King David. Samuel is, you can think of him as kind of a hinge between getting us out of the dark days of the book of Judges, maybe thinking of him as the last of the judges that God raises up for a significant purpose and we'll find a family like David's family down the road. Faithful family who is, and because of the faithfulness and fidelity of Samuel's mother, as we'll see here, Hannah, this all comes about. God's always going to work through the faithfulness and fidelity of seemingly insignificant people in and around on the outskirts, but God's going to use these individuals in significant ways. So Samuel's to David as John the Baptist is to Jesus, getting us to the main point, you might say. All right, so let's take a look at some of the early section here in terms of focusing now on Hannah. Hannah's a lot like Ruth, although she's coming from as an Israelite, but the focus on Ruth and her demonstration of fidelity and loyalty and faith. She enters into the faith community, Ruth does. We see similar characteristics in Hannah, another significant female of the Bible and the biblical history. In the early chapters of the book of Samuel, we see Hannah struggling with not being able to provide a son for her husband Elkanah. So Hannah's in crisis. And here we have let's take a look at chapter 1, beginning in verse 12 through 18. We meet up with Hannah pouring her heart out before the Lord. Let's have, see, Jessica, why don't you read for us? Because we are talking about a woman here. So let's, 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 12 through 18.
As she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was speaking in her heart, only her lips moved, and her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli took her to be a drunken woman. And Eli said to her, "How long will you go on being drunk? Put your wine away from you." But Hannah answered, "No, my lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as worthless woman. I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation." Then Eli answered, "Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him." And she said, "Let your servant find favor in your eyes." Then the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad.
So you see here, the Lord is going to respond to her, really her faithfulness in reaching out. I mean, she's in a crisis situation, but she's also faithful. And we see how the Lord responds in verse 19. Then they arose early in the morning and worshipped before the Lord, capital L-O-R-D, and returned again to their house in Ramah. Elkanah had relations with Hannah, his wife, and the Lord remembered her. And it came about in due time after Hannah had conceived that she gave birth to a son, and she named him Shemuel, saying, "Because I have asked of him of the Lord." So the Lord's faithful in response, and she's going to, in response to the Lord's provision, Hannah's going to dedicate this young lad with regards to dedicating him to the ministry. And we see that in verse 27 and 28 in chapter 1. "For this boy I prayed, and the Lord has given me my petition which I ask of him. So I have dedicated him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he's dedicated to the Lord." The idea of dedication is lent, dedicated or lent to the Lord, and he worshiped the Lord there. Now let's take a little bit of time. So Samuel's going to kind of be that hinge to get us out of this 400-year period of spiritual fog or chaos that we've just referred to in the book of Judges. Out of the period of chaos emerges Israel's first kingmaker, and that's who we find in the prophet Samuel. And we look at some interesting things. I want to look at Hannah's song, or song of thanksgiving, that's recorded here in chapter 2, that's got some significant things that help us to also pick up on some of the things that we saw left over from the book of Judges with regards to the question of king and that kind of idea, the anticipation, kind of that forward-looking idea that we saw. And if we think of Hannah like Ruth as only as a faithful Israelite, she's stepping out of this chaos in her situation, trusting in the Lord, and also giving birth to the just right child at the just right time. She's going to produce Israel's kingmaker, as I said before. So this is what the Lord does and how the Lord responds to the prayers of faithful moms. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Let's see. Jessica, could you read for us in the beginning of Hannah's song, chapter 2, verses 1 through 3?
1 through 3?
Yep.
Then Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exalts in the Lord, my horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth speaks boldly against my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. There is no one holy like the Lord. Indeed, there is no one besides thee, nor is there any rock like our God. Boast no more so very proudly. Do not let arrogance come out of your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, and with him actions are holy."
So this poem is broken into like 3 stanzas, or you might say little sections. Verses 1 through 3. This first stanza focuses on, you might say, the incomparability of Yahweh, the Lord. And then we have stanza 2 in verse 4 down through verse 8. So let's have, Grace. Could you read for us in verse 4 down through verse 8? The first part of verse 8.
Walls of the mighty are shattered, but the feeble stirred on strength. Those who are full tire themselves out for breath, but those who are hungry cease to hunger. Even the barren gives birth to 7. The she who has many children languishes. The Lord kills and makes alive. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and rich. Or he also exalts. Raises the poor from the dust, lifts them from the ash heap, make them sit with nobles, spread the seat of honor.
Okay, let's pause there. So right there in the middle of verse 8 is where we want to pause. And that's the end of stanza 2, which is going to introduce a series, like you might think of it as a series of historical reversals over the life of a nation. So then we have stanza 3 beginning in the third part of verse 8 there, down through verse 10. For the pillars of the earth are Yahweh's, and he set the world on them. So who's sovereign here, right? Who's in control? Despite the chaos in the nations and everything that's going around, these reversals, Yahweh's on his throne, you see, and he keeps the feet of his godly ones. But the wicked ones are silenced in darkness, for not by might shall a man prevail. Those who contend with the Lord will be shattered. Against them he will thunder in the heavens. Yahweh will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king, and he will exalt the horn of his anointed. So this is a significant look forward. You hear it in some of the language there. So this recognition of, I think here, this pointing ahead, pointing this direction in the future with regards to what kind of king can come and to make this situation right. To establish this, really, what kind of king's going to come on the scene and kind of establish the Lord's agenda, to establish this new world order, not based on human strength, but on divine power. And you see that there in the closing verses of Hannah's prayer, or in this case, her song. So the Lord's Messiah is the one. You see that at the very end there with regards to at the end of verse 10. And will exalt. He will exalt the horn, or the idea, the strength is another way to translate that, the strength of his Messiah, his anointed. All right. So it's really almost prophetic. Really look at it, what Hannah is giving us here in this song. All right, so let's move on here. We have other similarities to how Hannah's song also connects and anticipates another famous song that was written by King David. Oh, that's not the right time. Let's look ahead to 2 Samuel. We're jumping ahead now to near the end of David's reign in 2 Samuel chapter 22. One of David's songs that's not in the book of Psalms, but it's in the actual book of Samuel. 2 Samuel 22. David spoke the words of this song to the Lord in the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of his enemies and from the hand of Saul. In verse 2 down through verse 3. And he said, the Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield. And here you have the repeated idea. And the horn of my salvation, or the strength of my salvation, my stronghold and my refuge, my Savior, thou dost save me from violence. And he goes on, I call upon the name of the Lord. So this is a kind of a parallel idea. It kind of forms a bookend. I like the idea of bookends, especially in the biblical context. So you've got Hannah's song forming a bookend with one of David's songs, significantly speaking of this same theological idea. David proclaims that the Lord is the strength or the horn of salvation, as does Hannah. And David's song will also continue to expand the role of Yahweh, the Lord, as both not only that, but the rock and the help in time of need. And we see that a little further on in David's song. Now I just messed up. So back to 2 Samuel 22. I got out of there too quick. 2 Samuel 22 and down to verse 32, down through verse 36. So let's have, could I have Patrick over here? Could you read for us in David's song, 2 Samuel 22, verse 32 through 36?
Who is God but the Lord? And who is a rock except our God? This God is my strong refuge and has made my way blameless. He made my feet like the feet of the deer and set me secure on the heights. Trains my hand for war so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. You have given me the shield of your salvation, and your gentleness made me great.
It's really encouraging. That picture there in verse 34, your translation said deer. Yeah, that's just the idea of, maybe you've heard of a famous book written by Hannah Horan called Hind's Feet for High Places. The idea of the hind, H-I-N-D, is the same idea of the deer. So hind's feet, is any of you have that in your translation? Yeah, the New American Standard. He makes my feet like hind's feet. So what's interesting, that's the reference to it right there. But this idea comes up again in Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 19. So it's this interesting picture, comes from David, but it's picked up again by prophets like Habakkuk. And this picture is of what does the faithful look like in times of distress or in times of difficult times. What? And the picture is this. There you go. There's the hind's feet. You see these specially designed feet that go on, and they're attached to these mountain goats that are actually within view of Jerusalem in the higher parts of the elevation. And you can see hind's feet for high places. Do they look distressed? Look like they know what they're doing. And specially designed feet allow them to grip on and find the places in which to find the footholds. And I can show you a video clip of these things hopping around right in the midst of all these really sharp crags and crevices. Just like there's no danger at all. It's this picture of faith. What did the faithful do when the Assyrians come knocking on the door? The Babylonians. What's the hind's feet on high places? Picture that emerges for the faithful remnant, wherever they are. So let's finish out today looking at, let's see, I've got just a few more minutes here. I want to compare Hannah's song here in 2 Samuel chapter 2 with another famous song, and it's Mary's song. Mary in the New Testament. We're actually going to cross over into the New Testament. So here's some interesting comparisons that we didn't read all of Hannah's song, but in the first part, 2 Samuel chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, you have verse 4, the bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble gird on strength. Verse 52 in the book of Luke, which records Mary's song, he has put down the mighty from their thrones and exalted those of low degree. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry have ceased to hunger. Mary says, he has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away, or he has sent away empty. So it's interesting, the comparison that you can make between Hannah's song of faith with the anticipation of the special one to be born and dedicated to Mary's song of faith, as she's anticipating the fulfillment of all of these promises and the birth of the Messiah. So the promised horn is now on the way for Mary in the New Testament context. We see some more similarities. Hannah will say, my heart exalts in the Lord. I rejoice in your salvation. Mary will say, my soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in. Hannah will say, there is none holy like the Lord. Mary will simply say, holy is his name. You see the parallel there. So it's interesting that Mary may have, she's coming from a faithful town where the covenant community has been well established for a long time. And in that town of, maybe with the influence there in Bethlehem and then around there, she's growing up knowing her Bible. Maybe she's having had her quiet time reading Hannah's song as a means of encouragement, maybe just a day or two before or something. So the mother of the promised horn. All right, so here is Hannah's. We get to now the boy Samuel, because he's dedicated to the Lord. Now here he is, getting started in learning the ropes with regards to what he's going to do as he's being prepared. And let's take a look now at 1 Samuel chapter 2. We have some remnants of the book of Judges showing up in the first book, 1 Samuel. And we see this with the sons of Eli and some of the stuff that they're up to. Let's have, let's see here. We'll jump over here to, let's see, Weston in the back. Let's have you read verse 12 down through verse 17.
Eli's sons were wicked men. They did not respect the Lord or the priest's share of the sacrifices from the people. When anyone offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a three-pronged meat fork while the meat was boiling and plunge it into the container, kettle, cauldron, or cooking pot. The priest would claim for himself whatever the meat fork brought up. This is the way they treated all the Israelites who came there to Shiloh. Even before that was burned, the priest's servant would come and say to the one who was sacrificing, give the priest some meat to roast, because he won't accept boiled meat from you, only raw. If that person said to him, the fat must be burned first, then you can take whatever you want for yourself. The servant would reply, no, I insist that you hand it over right now. If you don't, I'll take it by force. So the servant's sin was very severe in the presence of the Lord, because the men treated the Lord's offering with contempt.
Okay, so this is a judges-like account. You've got here priests who are obviously in the wrong. They are being willful in terms of their disobedience before the Lord. It's not unlike the roaming priest of Judges, what is it, chapter, the roaming Levite who who shows up at the household of Micah and establishes syncretistic religion. He talks about Yahweh, but he's also got pagan ephod and a shrine set up in Micah's household. So priests that are roaming around looking for a job, where should they be? They should be with God's people, at the place of worship, but instead they're out roaming around. And this is the chaotic book of Judges that we see. So this is just another example of we're still kind of getting out of this chaotic time. So in contrast, we see, and it's in the midst of this, that Hannah, whose name means grace, is going to act loyally, like Ruth before her, dedicating her son Samuel to the ministry under the tutelage of Eli the priest. So that's what we have as we start out in the book of 1 Samuel. In response to Hannah's dedication of Samuel to the service of the Lord, we see that Samuel now has a conversation. He's called by God. And in chapter 3, we have some of the details of the prophetic call of God that Samuel receives. 3 times he's called by the Lord, not unlike Moses before. And Samuel finds out that the Lord is very serious in bringing judgment upon the sons of Eli. And also subsequently, judgment is coming against Israel. So just after his calling, Israel is going to receive a striking blow. Defeat at the hands of the Philistines. If you remember, one of the precipitating events of the book of Judges, and if you have me for OT1, we talk about this, is the unconquered nations left behind from the book of Joshua. In other words, I should have maybe shown this to you, but in terms of the promised land map, we have the concentrated conquered territory kind of in the central area, but then in the outskirts, especially along the coastal region and in the northern part, unconquered nations. Joshua went so far, but not all the way. So if you read the book of Judges at the beginning, we see evidence that these unconquered nations are there and will continue to be as thorns in the side of. God will allow them to remain as a means of testing his people. Testing, the idea there is this idea of refinement. You'll hear me talk about that. Gold being refined, the impurities being kind of heated and forced out of the situation, left behind. So God's concern about development of the faith and fidelity of his nation, one of the instruments of that is pushing them in the direction they need to go. And here we have evidence of unconquered nations. The Philistines will continue to be a thorn in the side, especially during this early time of the monarchy, especially when we get into King David's reign. We talk about taking on the giant from the Philistines, right? We'll look at that next week. But what we have here in chapter 4, verses 1 through 4. Let's see here. Derek in the back. Could you read verses 1 through 4 in chapter 4?
Samuel?
1 Samuel chapter 4, 1 through 4.
And Samuel's word came to all Israel. Now the Israelites went out to fight against the Philistines. The Israelites camped at Ebenezer and the Philistines at Aphek. The Philistines deployed their forces to meet Israel, and as spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 of them on the battlefield. When the soldiers returned to the camp, the elders of Israel asked, "Why did the Lord bring defeat on us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh, so that he may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies." So the people sent men to Shiloh, and they brought back the ark of the covenant of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim. And Eli's 2 sons, Hophni and
Phineas.
Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God.
Okay, so sometimes when you read these texts, you have to ask yourself the question, what's wrong with this picture? Is there anything wrong with this picture? See anything? They've been defeated by the Philistines. Well, that might be your conclusion. So is the Ark of the Covenant, to have the Ark of the Covenant in the very location of where the conflict or the battle is taking place, the solution? Is that, or who's supposed to win the battle for the Israelites? Yeah. Is it? So God's presence with them on the battlefield could be there without the Ark of the Covenant. In other words, it's a little bit. We see that the Ark of the Covenant here, in the minds of Israel, is almost being turned into a rabbit's foot of sorts. If we just have it and we rub it enough times, it might bring us good luck or something. God's obligated now to bless us, and it caused the victory on the battlefield because we have the ark now right here in the middle of the battlefield. We brought it with us. He's obligated to bless us. It's this, here we have the early signs, and I've got 2 minutes. So this last idea of the afternoon is this syncretistic idea of sometimes syncretism kind of creeps in with this idea that if we just do this, or this, God's obligated to bless us. That sometimes can be the overflow of this syncretistic kind of thinking. What should have been said, and we're not going to see this kind of language until we get to the battle of David taking on the giant Goliath from the Philistines. The right theology for the battlefield should be simply this. No, we're going to win the battle today because we're trusting in the Lord. And the Lord has promised if we fight the battle God's way, He'll bring us the victory. We don't have to have a rabbit's foot. So anyway, we'll evaluate some of this next week. So thank you for your attention today. We've got some assignments to do this week, some activity in week 2, assignment folder. Be sure to look there, and we'll see you next week.